I've been asked to speak about Tony from a Laterno perspective, and even though I worked with him for 10 years, I think maybe you picked the wrong guy, because when I think of Tony, I think about him as a friend and a brother way more than I do a coworker. But I can tell some stories about what it was like to work with Tony. At a personal level, Tony was invaluable to me because he was the one guy I could always count on to be later to a meeting than I was. I kind of have a laid-back sort of Latin American relationship with time, but Tony had his own completely unique thing that we called Tony time. And when he found out that we called it Tony time, he didn't like that. If you ever worked with Tony, you know that he had a pretty unique communication style. Some of you may not have noticed, but he could be a bit of a mumbler. And some of our conversations would take 2 or 3 tries before I figured out what he was saying. But a lot of times it was hard to keep track of what he was saying because he was so smart, he was 3 steps ahead of you and on what he was talking about. And it would take me some time to catch up. Because Tony had every number or email or process or person he'd ever encountered in his job, he had it memorized and carried it all up in here. And he had so much context for everything. And I was always playing catch up to try to figure out where we were in the conversation. Sometimes he'd walk into my office and he'd say, "So what are we gonna do about that?" And I'd say, "I've done a lot of things today, Tony. I don't know what we're talking about." But he always knew. And he was so incredibly smart. He understood so many things that we didn't understand in student life, student affairs. I work in the office of student affairs at Laterno. A lot of us are kind of big picture thinking people that don't know a lot about the details and the processes. But Tony really understood how everything worked. He was such a blessing to us. He was the one guy we could count on to actually understand things. And so I'd be in a meeting with some people from IT and some people from different departments across campus, and the guy from IT would say something like, "Well, the reg windows are opening up soon and the rollers are going to bring the data in, so do you have that formatted correctly for migration?" And I would be about to say, "Nobody knows what you're talking about." But before I could say that, Tony would say, "Yeah, we got that, we can handle that." And he would do it, and I have no idea what he did. And we're screwed because I don't know what's gonna happen to the rollers or the data migration. And during different times, Tony and I, we've worked together for 10 years, so we'd have some different relationships in terms of what his responsibilities were and what mine were. And there was a very brief period of time where I supervised him, and he was an interim director of residence life, and he had to make some tough calls, and there were hard decisions, and we didn't know what to do sometimes, and Tony would come in, and he would just have to process, and I would say, at the end, I'd say, "Well, what do you think we should do?" And he'd tell me, and I'd say, "Let's go do that." Because Tony, my motto in the office was, "Tony's not wrong." And sometimes it would take a while for him to explain to you exactly what he meant, but as soon as you understood it, you're like, "Oh yeah, that guy's on to something." Because Tony, no matter what the situation was, he always seemed like he knew what to do. If something broke, Tony could fix it. If we didn't understand something, Tony understood it. And he always wanted to help make things better, whether it was his job or not. Tony had a little theme song for some people in our office. "Tony's on the case." Because sometimes there'd be some kind of mystery that we didn't understand or couldn't figure out why ID cards weren't working or something, and we knew that Tony would get to the bottom of it. And I had more than one person tell me that they just felt like if somebody else had died, Tony would have known how to fix it. Because Tony was a little bit of an office dad. That was just kind of his personality. Wasn't the oldest person in the office, but he was the most dad-like. He was the kind of guy that would remind everyone when it was time to renew our membership to a professional organization. Every year before I went up for Christmas, he would always ask me what route I was taking, what interstate I was going to drive up to Ohio. And I never knew because I have a GPS, but he always had a better advice, to avoid traffic. Whenever we traveled to a conference, Tony was the guy that would always drive the rental car. He always had the itinerary, he knew where we were going. He'd always be the guy to take a bunch of pictures and send them to us in a Google Drive later. One time our whole staff was trying to fly to Chicago for this conference, and because of weather, some of us got rerouted. And so me, Hannah, and Jake were stuck in Kansas City while everybody else was in Chicago. And we're trying to get on the next flight, right? And I'm standing at the service counter, and Tony starts texting me from Chicago. He's like, there are 2 seats available on this flight, and there are 2 seats available on this other flight. And so if you guys hustle, you can make it to the other side of the airport, and you can do it. And I'm like ignoring his texts because I'm trying to like actually talk to the person at the service counter because I'm actually there. And then like 10 seconds later, Hannah gets a phone call, and Hannah's like, yeah, Tony, Steve knows, we're trying to fix it, it's okay. But he was right, his way was actually faster. And I know this story says a lot more about me probably than Tony, but it tells you kind of about our relationship and how we work together. But one time Courtney and I, my wife, we were planning a cruise. And Tony was really interested in this. He wanted to kind of help plan whatever. I wasn't interested. I was like, I'm just excited to be going. So Tony would say, hey, what ship are you taking? And I'd say, I don't know. They all kind of look the same. They're just boats. And Tony was like, no. And then I almost broke Tony because he said, where's it going? Like, where are you stopping? I was like, I don't know. The captain is driving the boat. I'm just gonna get on the thing and I'm gonna get off at the place, And this was the worst thing Tony had ever heard. And so we're in the office. This is like a big point of like contention in the office because now Tony is vicariously more worried about my vacation than I am. And so he comes to me one day and he says, Steve, I'm stressed about your vacation. And so he comes to me, he's printed out some stuff. He's like, Steve, here are some excursions you can take. Here's whatever, because he'd Googled my boat and he had Googled everything and he knew about my trip. And and so truth be told, here's a part of the story Tony does not actually know. A week before the cruise, I was like, Tony might be right. I'll like log on and see if I need to reserve any extra stuff. And they had canceled my reservation because I hadn't confirmed payment, and I actually was not going on a cruise. And so I had like 3 days to like buy like the last room available and get on the boat and everything. And because Tony was concerned, I actually was able to go on the cruise, and I didn't show up without a reservation. And I never thanked him for that because I was too embarrassed about how right he was. Another way that he was the office dad is he always had a guy for everything, and he always knew the best thing to do or the best place to get something. If you needed to know the best person in town to get something done, he had a guy. He knew about insurance policies, student loans, or how to get the best deal on a car, and he always wanted to help you with all of those things. You might think I'm joking, but this is very true. And in the years that I've known Tony, I've never made a major purchase or a major financial decision without consulting him, because he was the wisest person that I knew with those kinds of things. And so most of the stuff I own is Tony approved. One time I went to his office and I was going to ask him about opinions on buying a TV, and he pulled up a consumer report on TVs that he had saved to his hard drive because he knew, and he helped me get the right one. And maybe this is stuff that you all kind of knew about Tony because you worked with him or you've seen him in action. But maybe something you didn't know is that Tony, who is this analytical, practical, logical, process-oriented, detail-driven guy who basically had a computer for a brain, was a really big softie. A lot of students probably think of Tony as the guy who didn't want to let them live off campus, but that wasn't the truth. He was the guy that was secretly looking for a way to say yes. He was the guy that would come back to me and say, but do you think maybe this guy had a hard, semester? Maybe we could kind of do this for him. When he was doing discipline and conduct things, he was always the guy that was looking to extend grace, trying to figure out, like, how could we make this not so hard on the student? And he didn't get to show that all the time, because then he just had to send back the email that says, sorry, you've been denied. But Tony hated that. And so if you're the person who just got an email from Tony, or better yet, one of his ominous text messages that just ended with ... and you're laughing if you text with Tony, because he does that, and I don't know why. But you maybe didn't know how much he loved to talk in person, how much he wanted to tell stories and laugh and joke with you, and how much he loved teaching and mentoring. He loved teaching students, and when he moved into a role where he did a little bit less of that, he really loved teaching our staff. Just had a heart for mentoring. And I'm going to wrap up with this. I know I'm supposed to talk about Tony from a Laterno perspective, but I really just need to say, for those of you who know him primarily from work, it is impossible to know Tony unless you've seen him with his family. You just do not have the full story. When I first met them and just kind of knew him a little bit around the office, I kind of had him pegged as sort of a grouchy, kind of Ron Swanson type guy who didn't have a lot of time for touchy-feely stuff. And then Ava was born, and I got to see him as a father, and I just saw that there is a whole different side of this guy that I would have never known, talking about housing and meal plans and things at Laterno. That he was really good at teasing and tickling and playing silly games. That he knew about Daniel Tiger and Disney princesses. Between the two of them, I think Ava and Mia have about 8,000 little stuffed animals. And I think Tony knew the name for every single one of them. We went on a trip, a professional work trip to Chicago, and he brought this little turtle, Francine. And I think you saw her in some of the pictures up there, and we stopped and took pictures with Francine everywhere because that was his top priority while we were out in the big city, was bringing back these pictures for his girls. And Tony was at home just like he was at work. It's that dependable guy who would always be there and was always taking care of everything. And you know that he would have just kept doing that for years. He would have been the type of dad that would have never missed Eli's baseball games, or would have been such a scary dude for Mia's first boyfriend to meet. And you could know that he would have never let Ava drive anywhere without knowing that her car was all good to go and taken care of, and that she knew where her insurance was. And I'm gonna remember Tony for a lot of reasons. He was a good coworker, a good friend. But no matter how good he was at his job, when I remember Tony, I'm always gonna think about him as a great husband and a great dad. And I'm gonna miss him.